It's my pleasure and my privilege to give you Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad.
Thank you very, very much, Hoy, for that very generous introduction, and to thank all of you, such tireless advocates for justice. I have to say that I've been incredibly impressed with so much that I've heard this evening. The work the BPI is doing here can help to shape the fortunes and the lives of so many others. So please keep on keeping on. I also want to say that the mission of this organization, A Just Society, is precisely the kind of conversation and debate that I have with my students all semester long. We talk at length about what it means to distinguish between a concept such as justice versus something else that I think all too many Americans are happy with, which is the concept of opportunity. Those two things are not one and the same. And while we can talk a lot about what access means and the pathways that we create for people to have a better life, it's not the same thing to measure our own success by the outcomes versus the opportunity. And so I'm grateful for learning a little bit more carefully about this work and by being inspired by it and having a chance to teach it and share it with others. So let me paint a picture that may be obvious to some, but often goes underappreciated in our daily walk. So when I think about neoliberalism, I think about a market response to inequality. But we have another example that we don't really pay as much attention to because it's been under attack for precisely the same half century that I've described. The New Deal brought with it not just the greatest period of equality in American history, this is a fact, but it brought with it the highest marginal tax rates, an average of about 75% at the highest tax bracket. The New Deal, with those high taxes, brought equality and subsidized an infrastructure that gave us actually the civil rights movement. Now, make no mistake about it, the New Deal did not achieve racial justice. But if we're fighting on two fronts, oftentimes intersecting on those two fronts, we've been losing on both. Or in all the talk from Arlie Hochschild, or the 400-year history of white trash, or the reboot of Roseanne's show, this notion that somehow working-class white Americans are victims of a larger system that is unfairly mistreating them, that somehow their opportunity structures, that they can't count on their children to do better than they, get a pass somehow, that the system isn't working for them, but for African Americans, it's their own bad behavior. That's the intersection of that gospel of personal responsibility from the mouth of a black first, of someone whose own life intersected with black capitalism as a way of satisfying the need for what I will call symbolic inclusion, that we just want black people at the table of domination. We're not interested in actually changing the place settings. I think, taking stock of all this, we've put a little bit too much faith in exceptional black firsts and not enough faith in the actual communities that gave birth to American democracy. So here's one bit of wisdom I think we should take from this moment. The 50-year-old rules for racial advancement are now obsolete. There is no racial barrier left to break. There's no office in the land to which an African American can ascend from mayor to attorney general to the presidency that will serve as a magical platform for saving black people and our nation's soul from its racist past. We cannot engineer a more equitable nation simply by dressing up institutions in more shades of brown. Instead, we must confront structural racism and the values of our institutions. And here's the key. Without a mobilized black politics, American democracy is even more vulnerable to internal attacks by those who have been openly suspicious of mass democratic movements for decades. We also must recognize that capitalism on its own terms will not save us either. None of us. That the trade-offs for innovation, the trade-offs for wealth accumulation are the same trade-offs that made the nation a very rich nation 250 years ago. Those trade-offs mean that some lives are unworthy of investment, that when the greatest recession since the Great Depression found banks engaging in predatory lending practices and the NAACP sued those banks, the deal, the money payments, the settlements, according to Cornell Brooks, was money for financial literacy training for black folks. Think about that, folks. Unregulated finance took advantage of people who were benefiting from government programs to increase the greatest asset that you can have in this economy, were then subject to usurious lending rates and deceitful lending practices. And the solution to their penitence was to give money to encourage black and brown people and poor people in general to be smarter when the next mortgage broker calls them and says, "I've got a great deal for you." That's where we are right now. To divest of whiteness would mean not just building a new set of policies and a new infrastructure, call it a New Deal. It would require also taking on the old mythologies of our nation's founding and what a liberal democracy has actually meant for most people in this country. That's the work. That's opening the gates on chaos. That's destroying the mythology of the dream and building a new one. If the indigenous of this land do not get to redefine the very meaning of Columbus Day, adding them to the existing holiday is as empty a gesture as Robert E. Lee and Martin Luther King Day in the state of Virginia. My critique here is rooted not in moral absolutes or a lack of appreciation for compromise and middle road solutions. My critique is rooted in seeing the pattern of this symbolic inclusion playing out over time as an insufficient remedy to the cancer of systemic racism. Welcoming the victims of the past to the table of domination is to do precisely what we have done since the end of the civil rights movement. As wave after wave of black folks assimilated into institutions built to discredit or to destroy or to erase the community institutions that nurtured those black trailblazers in the first place. James Baldwin called this the price of the ticket for integration. So you see, when Rudolph Giuliani or anybody else talks about black-on-black crime in Chicago, it is a long-running script for deflecting from the actual state violence that has abetted the premature death of black people in this country. No matter whether it was slow or fast, hard or soft, no matter who pulled the trigger or tightened the noose, the fact of black lives have long been cheap in this society. And in this trade-off between what we need to do to talk about violence, we miss that we've always known what to do. When Chicago's streets ran with the blood of the Italian and the Irish and the Polish and the Jews, when they fought over the meager scraps of this economic system that refused to reward hard work and ambition equally, the progressives built a new system. They taxed the wealthy, they wrangled dollars from the elite, and they eventually put in the White House a president who insisted upon changing our economic system. That is the legacy, and that is partly the choice that we have before us.